A dead man left behind one final letter, and it seemed to point directly to the killer. But when Inspector Purbright looked closer, he realized the most important clue in the case was also the most dangerously misleading. In Stillborn, where feelings were seldom expressed until they had gone slightly stale, it was considered bad form to bring death into the assembly rooms before the prize chrysanthemums. Yet this was what Mr. Gerard Fanshawe found himself obliged to do at 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon, while Mrs. Bickerton was still arguing that her marmalade had been marked down out of prejudice rather than principle. The harvest show had begun in its usual manner, with a smell of damp tweed, apples, and competitive baking, with an undernote of old grievances, and with the calm assumption, held by nearly everyone present, that their own exhibits had not been properly appreciated. Mr. Fanshawe, who chaired the committee with a grim fidelity to rules nobody else had read, was adjusting the cards beneath the dahlias when the village boy from the Elms came hurrying in with a blue envelope on a tray. It was the tray that unsettled people first. Boys did not usually carry letters on trays unless a woman had told them to, and women did not usually instruct boys to do that unless they wished the thing noticed. "For you, sir," said the boy, breathing hard. Miss Prill said at once. Mr. Fanshawe took the envelope. On the front, in a neat, dark hand he knew too well, was written, "To Gerard Fanshawe, to be opened immediately if I am dead." He stood perfectly still for a moment. It was not his habit to stand still in public unless he intended to object to something. The room, which had been lightly occupied with jam and disappointment, turned its attention toward him. Mrs. Agnes Chalk, at the tea-table near the windows, paused with the teapot in her hand. Mrs. Chalk always paused decisively, so that even her stillness suggested management. She was a widow of about 50, handsome in a solid and unadvertised way, and ran the village shop, the postal counter, and, in practice, a good deal else besides. If she had been told that a letter could not possibly concern her, she would have believed it for perhaps 3 seconds. "Is anything wrong?" she asked. "Nothing I can say at present," said Mr. Fanshawe, which instantly suggested that several things were wrong. He broke the seal. Those nearest saw his face alter, not dramatically, but with the pinched reluctance of a man compelled to host vulgarity. "Well?" said Major Cresset. The Major had retired from the army with the conviction that hesitation wasted time and bred foreigners. He moved closer, his moustache lifting slightly at the prospect of impropriety. Mr. Fanshawe cleared his throat. "I think," he said, "Dr. Vesey ought to hear this." But Dr. Vesey was already entering from the side door, removing his gloves as he came. He was a brisk, narrow man who gave the impression that illness was mainly a matter of untidiness. Several heads turned from the envelope to him with a speed that would have gratified any conjurer. "Well," he said, seeing their faces, "I can save the suspense. Felix Mordaunt is dead." The sentence landed in the room with extraordinary politeness. No one cried out. Mrs. Bickerton sat down because her knees had chosen the moment to become political. Someone dropped a teaspoon into a saucer. Mrs. Chalk, who had not put down the teapot, set it exactly on its mat and folded her hands. "Dead?" said the rector's wife faintly. "Here in the village?" "No," said the Major. "He went to Brighton for it." Dr. Vesey ignored him. "At the Elms." Miss Prill found him in the breakfast room. "I cannot say more until things are properly seen to." He looked at the envelope. "What has he written now?" Mr. Fanshawe would have preferred privacy, dignity, and perhaps a locked drawer, but privacy had already gone out through the swing doors and was moving briskly down the high street. "He says," said Mr. Fanshawe, in the tone of a man reading minutes he profoundly disapproved of, "If I am dead when this reaches you, do not accept any appearance of innocence from Mrs. Agnes Chalk. She has had both opportunity and cause, and if I have been made away with, she is the person to whom you should first direct attention." No one spoke for several seconds. The silence was not empty, it was densely furnished. Every acquaintance, slight, practical, or malicious that anybody had ever had with Agnes Chalk seemed to rearrange itself behind their eyes. Then Mrs. Chalk said, "That is a very unpleasant thing to have read out over the scones, Gerard." Her voice was even. Only those who knew her well noticed that she had addressed him by his Christian name. This meant either that she was controlling herself admirably or that she had gone beyond caring. "I am sorry," said Mr. Fanshawe stiffly. The circumstances, said Mrs. Chalk, "are that Mr. Mordaunt disliked a great many people and had a positive genius for writing it down." "That may be so," said Dr. Vesey, "but it does complicate matters." Miss Lavender Bickerton, who believed a plain thing ought to be plainly said, unless it concerned her own family, turned to look directly at Mrs. Chalk. "Had you quarrelled with him?" "My dear Lavender," said Mrs. Chalk, "in Stallbourne one does not require a quarrel in order to be disliked by Mr. Mordaunt. One only requires existence." This was true enough to produce a small movement in the room. But Felix Mordaunt, who had lived alone at the Elms since his sister's death, had been rich, exact, litigious in the small domestic sense, and unpersuaded that other people's convenience possessed any moral value. He had written letters to the parish council, the water board, the bishop, the cricket club, and, when driven to extremity, to individuals. He preferred the written grievance because it could not be interrupted. Major Cresset said, "Still, he names you." "Yes," said Mrs. Chalk, "I have noticed." The boy with the tray, who had remained because departure at such a moment would have felt almost theatrical, shifted from foot to foot. Dr. Vesey held out his hand. "May I?" Mr. Fanshawe surrendered the letter. The doctor read it through, then turned it over. "Is that all?" asked the rector's wife. "There is a postscript," said Dr. Vesey. "Miss Prill may not know as much as she thinks she does." That improved nothing. Miss Prill, housekeeper to the late Mr. Mordaunt for 12 years, was known to know as much as she thought she did on almost every subject. "Where is she now?" asked Mr. Fanshawe. "At the house," said Dr. Vesey. "With a constable. I have sent for the county police. Under the circumstances, it would be absurd not to." The word absurd carried weight in Stallbourne. Sin might be privately accommodated, vice explained away, but absurdity was difficult to survive. Mrs. Chalk removed her apron, folded it once, and laid it on the table. "Then I shall go home and wait for them," she said. "I don't think that would be wise," said Dr. Vesey. She looked at him. "Do you imagine I shall run for the Argentine between now and the arrival of Inspector whoever he is?" "No," said the doctor. "I imagine 6 people will say you did if you leave this room." "That," said Mrs. Chalk, "is more nearly Stallbourne." So she stayed. Inspector Daniel Rook arrived 40 minutes later, when the cakes had dried slightly at the edges, and everyone's sympathy had begun to sort itself into camps. He was a spare, fair man in his early 40s, with a face that seemed almost too mild until one found that mildness had not prevented him from noticing anything. He took off his coat in the anteroom because it was raining and entered as if called to a committee meeting rather than a death. Mr. Fanshawe, who respected official procedure, provided it was carried out in an official tone, visibly improved. Rook listened first. He was given the letter, the doctor's account, the names of those present, 3 rival descriptions of Felix Mordaunt's temperament, and 1 irrelevant history of the church boiler. He received all of it with a courtesy which made people more expansive than they intended. While they spoke, he looked not so much at faces as at intervals, who answered too quickly, who found teacups suddenly fascinating, who allowed themselves to be indignant before being asked. At last he turned to Mrs. Chalk. "You knew Mr. Mordaunt well?" "As well as a shopkeeper knows any customer who mistrusts change and enjoys complaint." "And had you, in fact, had cause to quarrel with him?" "I had cause," she said, "to wish him elsewhere on a number of occasions. That is not uncommon in retail." A few people smiled unwillingly. Rook did not. "Did he ever accuse you directly of harming him? Of overcharging him?" short-weighing him, delaying his newspapers, interfering with his post, and encouraging boys to cycle over his verge, never, so far as I recall, of murder. Rook inclined his head. "And did you interfere with his post?" Mrs. Chalk met his eyes. "Inspector, I am the post office for half the day. If you mean, did I tamper with his letters? No." There was, behind the calm reply, the first edge of something harder. Several people noticed it and took private positions. Rook folded the letter once more and slipped it into his notebook. "I should be grateful," he said, "if nobody left the village until I have spoken to them. I do not suggest guilt. I do suggest inconvenience." It was beautifully judged. In Stallborn, guilt might be debated, but inconvenience was undeniable. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Before I go to the Elms, I should like to know who last saw Mr. Mordaunt alive." And because that question was both simple and dangerous, the room became still again. By 5:30, Stallborn had divided the death of Felix Mordaunt into 3 manageable portions: the shock, the practical inconvenience, and the question of who ought properly to call on Agnes Chalk. The first was already softening into recollection. The second was being discussed in terms of church flowers, postponed errands, and whether the assembly rooms should still be locked by 7. The third was the most difficult because it involved sympathy without endorsement. Mrs. Chalk spared them the decision by returning to the shop. She did not go through the front. She came in by the side passage, removed her hat, tied on another apron, and asked Nora Pike, her assistant, whether the bread order had been checked. Nora, a pale young woman whose nerves were arranged on a temporary basis, stared at her. "Mrs. Chalk, ought you to be here?" "Almost certainly not," said Mrs. Chalk. "But people will want paraffin, and if I sit at home they will only come and be kind to me in batches." This was perfectly true. Kindness in villages was often sincere and exhausting. Nora lowered her voice. "Do you think that is—" "I think," said Mrs. Chalk, taking up the ledger, "that by tomorrow morning somebody will remember I once charged Mr. Mordaunt for 6 rashers when he only wanted 4, and from there the thing will gather shape." Nora looked stricken. "My dear girl, do not look like that. It makes customers believe the butter is off." The bell over the door rang. Mrs. Haviland came in for candles and news, in that order. She was the rector's sister, a woman who carried benevolence about with her like a rigid parasol. On seeing Mrs. Chalk behind the counter, she arranged her face into something between concern and tactful surprise. "My dear Agnes, I hardly expected—" "No," said Mrs. Chalk. "That was one of my reasons." Mrs. Haviland accepted this as if it had been a difficult prayer. She bought 2 boxes of candles, asked after Nora's influenza from last winter, and finally said, "It is a shocking business. Of course, one must not attend to dreadful allegations. Poor Mr. Mordaunt had become quite singular." "Quite," said Mrs. Chalk. "But people will talk." They would have managed without the letter. Mrs. Haviland hesitated. "Were you much in the habit of seeing him?" "Every Tuesday, Friday, and whenever he had discovered a new defect in the coal." "That is not quite what I meant." "No," said Mrs. Chalk. "I did not suppose it was." Mrs. Haviland coloured slightly, paid, and departed with the expression of a woman who had failed in charity through no fault of her own. At 6 o'clock, Inspector Rook came in out of the rain. He removed his hat carefully, as if aware the shop was a place where hats observed their own social rules. There were 2 customers near the jars of barley sugar and one beside the bacon slicer. All 3 became deeply engaged by goods they had no intention of buying. "Mrs. Chalk," said Rook, "if you can spare 10 minutes—" "I can spare 15 if they are used intelligently," she said. She led him through the curtain into the little parlour behind the shop. It was a room with horsehair chairs, a narrow grate, and the uneasy cleanliness of somewhere never intended for strangers. A canary in the window regarded the inspector with philosophical dislike. Rook remained standing until she had sat down, He noticed the habit and filed it with the rest. "I have come from the Elms," he said. "And Mr. Mordaunt died sometime between breakfast and 11. Dr. Vesey will be firmer later. There is nothing, at present, to prove murder. But there is a letter to improve the atmosphere." "Yes." "Then perhaps you had better ask whatever is expected of you." Rook sat down opposite her. "When did you last see Mr. Mordaunt?" "Yesterday morning. He came in for stamps, writing paper, and a quantity of complaint. The complaint cost nothing, which may explain its abundance." "What was the subject?" "Miss Prill." "That seems common enough." "She had," he said, "exceeded her position." He never specified how. With Mr. Mordaunt, people were perpetually exceeding their position by remaining recognizably human. Rook gave the smallest sign that he had heard and appreciated this, though it did not appear to amuse him. "Did he mention making a will, or writing letters in expectation of death?" "No." "Was he in fear of someone?" Mrs. Chalk considered. "He lived in permanent expectation of misconduct, but fear? No. Annoyance came more naturally to him." "Did he have cause against you?" "I refused him credit in February." "That sounds definite." It was. He objected to an item on his account, which had been on his account for 3 months. We had a short scene in which he suggested I was exploiting his age, and I suggested he was overlooking arithmetic. He paid at last and sent me a note the following day to say my tone had been wholly unsuitable in trade. "You still have the note?" "Inspector, I receive notes from half the village objecting to facts. I do not preserve them in albums." "Pity," said Rook mildly. She looked at him with the first faint interest she had yet shown. "You are not much what I expected." "No? I had imagined someone heavier." "I am heavier on paper." That, against her better judgment, made her smile. He asked next about the post. Since Felix Mordaunt had been a large writer of letters and a suspicious receiver of them, the subject could not be avoided. Mrs. Chalk explained the village arrangements with exactness. Mail arrived at 9:15, went out at 4:30, parcels irregularly, telegrams rarely, and never when convenient. And Mr. Mordaunt collected his own? When it suited him. At other times Miss Prill sent the maid or one of the garden boys. Could anyone have known what correspondence he was receiving? In a village, Inspector, one can know without seeing. Thick envelopes from solicitors, foreign stamps from a nephew in Canada, circulars from seed firms, and pious appeals from charities that imagined him sentimental on Thursdays. And you? I knew the same as anyone who handles postbags and possesses eyes, not contents. Rook let that rest. He had already spoken to Miss Prill, who possessed a face like a shut umbrella and an evident view on everyone's deficiencies. She had said, among other things, that Mr. Mordaunt had been worried for a week, had taken to locking the breakfast-room escritoire, and had insisted his personal letters were not to be touched. She had also said, with considerable force, that Mrs. Chalk had ways about her. Miss Prill had not defined the phrase, perhaps because its usefulness lay in remaining undefined. "Did you know Mr. Hilary Vale was at the Elms yesterday afternoon?" Rook asked. Mrs. Chalk's expression altered a fraction. "Was he?" "So I am told." Hilary Vale lived at the Dower House beyond the churchyard and painted watercolours of local scenes in a manner the village found tasteful because it was expensive. He was 45, charming when necessary, and frequently short of money in a way that preserved his manners while thinning his morals. "If he was there," said Mrs. Chalk, "he had some reason. Mr. Mordaunt disliked casual callers. Mr. Vale says he went to ask whether Mordaunt would renew his subscription to the Horticultural Trust. Hilary would ask an unguarded corpse for a subscription if he thought the answer might be yes. Rook looked down at his notebook but did not write that, and Major Cresset. What about him? He also called, around 10. For what? To return a book. At that, Mrs. Chalk actually laughed, though not pleasantly. Then the Major has taken to fiction. Rook raised his head. You doubt it? I know it. Major Cresset borrows books only when he thinks a lending system proves moral weakness. He and Mr. Mordaunt had not spoken civilly for months. Why not? Because of a strip of land near the allotments, 2 hens, and something said about jurisdiction. You had better ask the Major which of them he believes he owns. The canary hopped once along its perch and resumed disapproval. Rook closed the notebook. One final question. Did Mr. Mordaunt ever write to you personally in the last few days? Mrs. Chalk's hands, which had been lying quietly in her lap, tightened and relaxed. It was a small thing, but it was the first outright interruption in her composure. No, she said. Rook stood up. You have not asked whether I killed him, she observed. Not directly. Why not? Because, said Rook, taking his hat, people generally answer the direct question too neatly. When he had gone, Mrs. Chalk remained sitting for a moment in the little parlour, quite still, while in the shop Nora's voice rose anxiously over a request for half an ounce of tea. Then Mrs. Chalk stood, straightened the cuffs of her blouse, and returned to the counter. 10 minutes later, Major Cresset was seen crossing the street toward the public house with the gait of a man who intended to defend principle over whiskey. At almost the same moment, Hilary Vale, elegant even in poor weather, turned in at the side gate of the rectory. Since both men had called on Felix Mordaunt within an hour of his death, and both had reasons to dislike him, Stallborn felt the case had begun to behave in a more proper manner. It was so much easier when suspicion became distributed. By the following morning, the village had become moral in layers. At the outer layer, people were shocked. A man had died unexpectedly. A letter had named a respectable woman. The police had begun asking questions in rooms where they were usually offered only sponge cake. Beneath this, people were interested. Beneath that, they were relieved the matter was not, at least for the present, a burglary committed by tramps. At the centre, where truth and appetite commonly sat together in small communities, several persons found the whole thing invigorating. Inspector Rook began the day with Major Cresset. The Major received him in the breakfast room of the Hollies, a house built in a period when solidity had been mistaken for beauty and maintained ever since on the theory that discomfort encouraged standards. The walls carried hunting prints, regimental photographs, and a framed map on which the Empire remained in better repair than it had been for some time. Major Cresset himself, clean-shaven except for his moustache, and dressed before 9 with military confidence, offered coffee as if issuing a challenge. Rook accepted. I understand, he said, when the housemaid had gone, that you called on Mr. Mordaunt yesterday morning. Yes. To return a book? The Major gave him a look at once pained and combative. I said so, yes. And was it true? Inspector, one does not expect to be cross-examined over literature before coffee. One often is, over worse. Major Cresset's fingers moved once on the arm of his chair. Very well. No, it was not a book. I thought perhaps not. I went to speak to him about a boundary matter. The strip by the allotments? Who told you that? Mrs. Chalk. The Major produced a short sound of disgust. Mrs. Chalk knows everybody's business, though how she finds the time, while weighing dripping and opening telegrams, I cannot imagine. She seems efficient. That is one word. What would yours be? Major Cresset considered and decided, with visible reluctance, to remain nominally fair. Capable, interfering, extremely self-possessed. The village has got into the habit of letting her arrange things. It is not healthy. Rook let that sit where it belonged. And Mr. Mordaunt? A tedious old litigant. He had moved a portion of fencing and was pretending confusion over the survey map. We had words. How strong were they? Perfectly ordinary words. Ordinary for whom? The Major's moustache stiffened. He accused me of trespass. I informed him that if he understood land as poorly as he understood manners, his affairs must be in chaos. He said my affairs had been in chaos since Suez. That was impertinent. It was also historical. I am not discussing foreign policy with a dead man. Were there witnesses? Only his maid passed through the hall. Miss Prill? No, the younger one. Alice something. Rook noted it. How long were you there? 10 minutes. Did you see anyone else arrive or leave? No. Did Mr. Mordaunt seem unwell? He seemed himself, which is to say spiteful and alert. And when you left? I came straight home. Rook did not at once ask the next question. He looked instead at the coffee tray, the silver spoon laid exactly parallel to the knife, and the Major's right cuff, which had a fresh brownish mark near the button. Have you been gardening this morning? He asked. The Major looked down almost imperceptibly. I inspected the lower beds. In town shoes? The Major said, Inspector, if you are asking whether I struck Felix Mordaunt with a trowel, the answer is no. Rook smiled very faintly. I was only admiring your adaptability. He left the Hollies with nothing conclusive and several useful impressions. Major Cresset had gone to the Elms under false pretenses, had quarrelled with the dead man, and disliked Agnes Chalk with conviction that predated the letter. Yet he possessed the kind of anger that preferred daylight and witnesses. Men like the Major did not generally kill in secret while believing themselves to occupy the moral high ground. They preferred to be heard not killing. His next call was on Hilary Vale. Vale lived in the Dower House, a Georgian arrangement of charm, damp, and deferred bills. The hall smelled faintly of lilies and overdue accounts. Hilary himself appeared in a velvet-collared jacket that suggested leisure but not prosperity, and received the inspector with handsome sorrow. Terrible business, he said. Quite grim for everyone, poor old Mordaunt, though poor is perhaps misleading in his case. That depends what one means, said Rook. Hilary smiled as men do when uncertain whether humour will be held against them. Do come in. The drawing-room contained low chairs. One sat in at one's social risk, a piano bearing unopened music, and several watercolours of local lanes made more picturesque than they had consented to be. Hilary offered cigarettes, then seemed to remember that official men sometimes preferred not to take favours before noon. I'm told, said Rook, that you visited Mr. Mordaunt yesterday afternoon. Yes, I wish I hadn't now, naturally, but hindsight is one of the few things this village produces in abundance. For the Horticultural Trust subscription. Hilary leaned back. Ah, that sounds thin, doesn't it? Does it? A little. He had subscribed once, years ago, but I doubt he knew the trust still existed. No, I went because he had written to me, rather unexpectedly. About? Hilary hesitated. It was graceful hesitation, but hesitation all the same. Money, in a way. In a way? He had some papers of my late father's, or said he had. Old notes, letters, one thing and another. My father and he had dealings over an investment before the war. Mordaunt hinted the papers might be of interest to me. Do. Why? My father was not a very exact man, nor a very solvent one. Mordaunt implied there might be embarrassment in the papers if I had political ambitions. Have you? Good heavens, no. I should have to attend things. Rook looked at him. Hilary went on more seriously. He wanted money for handing them over. Not a vulgar demand, you understand. Something dressed up as a charitable donation to preserve appearances. It was blackmail in an elderly key. And did you pay? No. I told him I would look at the papers first. Did you? He refused. Said I might inspect them when we had reached a figure. We had not reached one. We quarrelled civilly, and I left. At what time? A little before 4, I think. Did you see anyone else at the Elms? No one. Though as I was going up the drive, I thought I saw Mrs. Chalk's delivery bicycle near the side gate. Rook did not move. You thought? I cannot swear to it. One notices such things only afterwards, and then wonders whether one noticed them at all. That is often convenient. Hilary met the remark with injured elegance. If I wanted to be convenient, Inspector, I should say I saw nothing and had no reason to quarrel with anyone. Since I am not a fool, I assume honesty is still the better investment. Rook's expression scarcely altered, but he placed the statement where it would later be tested. From the dower house he went to the elms again, where the blinds in the front rooms were half drawn in a manner intended to suggest grief without encouraging interruption. The house itself stood back from the lane behind, clipped yews, and a gate too heavy for welcome. In life, Felix Mordaunt had liked order best when it made others slightly uncomfortable. In death, he had left much the same atmosphere. Miss Prill admitted the inspector and informed him, before he could speak, that the fishmonger had not yet been told and ought to be. She was a gaunt woman in black, with a face upon which years of obedience had produced not submission, but judgment. "I have thought of something further," she said, leading him into the morning room. "That is fortunate." "Yes," said Miss Prill, not recognizing the shade in his tone. "Yesterday, after Major Cresset had gone, Mr. Mordaunt asked whether the post had been locked in the hall desk." "The post?" "His outgoing letters. He had written 3 before breakfast." "To whom?" "I do not read gentlemen's correspondence, Inspector." "No?" She looked at him coldly. "Not unless there is a household reason." "And was there one yesterday?" "There may have been, but I was not obliged to seek it." He sat down near the window. The desk she indicated stood closed, its brass handle polished by a life of anxious use. "Did you see the letters later?" "No. The desk was empty after lunch." "Who had access?" "Mr. Mordaunt. Myself, if necessary. Alice, perhaps, but only for dusting, and she is not sharp enough to conceal it. No one else, unless they helped themselves." "Did Mrs. Chalk come to the house yesterday?" Miss Prill pressed her lips together. "Not through the front." "That was not the question." "No, I did not see her." Rook let her silence work. Miss Prill's dislike of Agnes Chalk was of an established kind, not dramatic enough to be useful at once, but persistent enough to have shaped observations over years. "You and Mrs. Chalk are not friends." "Inspector, I am not a woman of enthusiasms." Still, if you wish me to say she is over-familiar, influential, and too ready to make people beholden, I can say it, but I will not invent for effect." "Did Mr. Mordaunt fear her?" Miss Prill gave this careful thought. "He feared dependence of any kind. He did not like owing the village anything, and the village, through Mrs. Chalk, had a way of making itself useful. He disliked that." "Useful in what way?" "She arranged errands, recommended servants, knew who was short of cash and who was pretending not to be. A person in trade should not know so much. Yet they often do." She ignored this. "Mr. Mordaunt said once that she could ruin a person merely by knowing when to be kind. That stayed with him." As he left the room, the younger maid, Alice Drew, nearly collided with him in the passage carrying a folded sheet. She was a red-haired girl of 19, with the guilty expression of the perpetually innocent. "Sorry, sir." "What have you there?" She held out the sheet at once. "It was in the umbrella stand. I only found it now." It was a note, folded twice, with no envelope. On the outside, in Felix Mordaunt's unmistakable hand, was written, "For delivery, if needed." Rook opened it. The message was brief and unpleasantly clear. It stated that if anything untoward occurred, Mr. Hilary Vale was not to be trusted, and that certain papers would explain why. Alice stared at his face. "Is it bad, sir?" "It is becoming sociable," said Rook. He put the note away and looked back toward the dim hall, where Miss Prill had resumed directing grief into household management. By noon he had 1 dead man and now 2 warnings, each pointing in a different direction, each written by a man who had disliked nearly everyone on principle. There are villages in which character is simple because everyone has agreed on it in advance. Stallbourne was not one of them. Here, respectability did not conceal motive so much as embroider it, and Felix Mordaunt, from beyond the reach of contradiction, appeared determined to accuse the village one person at a time. If a death occurs in a village house before luncheon, there is commonly some consolation to be found in objects. The body may be removed, the doctor reserved, the police uninformative, but teacups remain where they were left, rugs continue to show mud, and half-read newspapers preserve the exact shape of a morning. For this reason, Inspector Rook returned to the Elms shortly after 2 with more interest in crockery than Miss Prill thought proper. She received the idea badly. "I cannot see," she said, preceding him into the breakfast room with the air of someone forced to entertain distasteful modern art. "What a teacup can tell you that a housekeeper cannot?" "That depends on the teacup," said Rook. The breakfast room had the thin, tidy melancholy of a place set right too soon. Mr. Mordaunt's chair stood slightly away from the table. The remains of the morning had been cleared hours ago under protest from the constable and under greater protest from Miss Prill, who considered a room half cleared more indecent than a room with a corpse in it. Yet the tray had been preserved on the sideboard, together with the coffee pot, the toast rack, the marmalade jar, 1 saucer, and a cup. Rook looked at them silently for a moment. "Only 1 cup?" he said. Miss Prill's face tightened. "Naturally." "You are certain?" Mr. Mordaunt breakfasted alone. He preferred it that way. "So I am told, but Dr. Vesey says there was mention of tea." "Coffee first," said Miss Prill. "Tea later, if he asked for it." "And did he?" "I cannot answer for every caprice of the late Mr. Mordaunt." "No," said Rook mildly. "Still, one likes to try." He moved nearer the tray. The preserved cup was a thin Worcester cup with a hairline crack near the handle. It bore a faint brown crescent in the bottom. The saucer beneath it was dry. "Where is the teacup?" he asked. Miss Prill gave him a level stare. There was no second cup. Alice Drew, dusting the bookcase in a manner suggesting she hoped not to exist, made the mistake of looking up. Rook noticed. "You think otherwise, Alice?" The girl flushed violently. I thought there was, sir, but perhaps not." Miss Prill turned on her at once. "You thought a great many things yesterday and said none of them usefully." Alice clutched her duster. "I brought in the hot water at 10:30, miss, and I'm nearly sure there was a teacup on the little table by the fire." Rook glanced toward the small occasional table near the hearth. Its polished top now held a fern and 2 magazines on bridge. One could imagine a cup having stood there. One could imagine almost anything in rooms so firmly arranged. Miss Prill said, with great control, "You are nearly sure because the inspector is asking." "No, miss." "Then be exact for once." Alice swallowed. "I saw a cup, miss, white with a blue edge. This set has no blue-edged cups." Alice opened and closed her mouth. "Then perhaps it was a saucer." Rook said, "Did you clear it?" "No, sir." "Who did?" "No one that I saw." Miss Prill made a sound so compressed it scarcely qualified as speech. "Inspector, if we are to build a case upon Alice's impressions of China, I fear the county will be occupied for months." "Perhaps," said Rook. "But objects are often better witnesses than people. They do not get offended and improve their memory." He asked for the kitchen, the scullery, and the dish cupboards. Miss Prill accompanied him as if daring the house to remain innocent under inspection. Nothing particularly helpful appeared in the first 10 minutes. Plates were stacked, cups washed, kettles behaving as kettles do when not suspected. Then, in the back pantry, Rook paused before a row of cups hanging upside down on hooks. One was not of the breakfast room set. It was plain white, with a narrow blue line at the rim. He took it down. "Yours?" he asked. Miss Prill looked annoyed by the existence of it. "That is from the old daily set. We use those below stairs." "It is clean." "Well, one washes cups." "Yes, promptly?" She did not answer at once. It was the first time that day her efficiency had failed to supply immediate language. At last, she said, "Alice washes up after the 11 o'clock tea things." Alice, from the doorway, said in a small, desperate voice, "I didn't wash that one, miss." Miss Prill turned. "Then perhaps the cup washed itself." "No, miss, but Mrs. Barden from the laundry came in before dinner and wanted hot water for her bottle, and I moved things, and perhaps—" Rook held up a hand, slowly. Alice started again, less successfully, but more usefully. "At some point late in the morning, After the doctor had come and gone, and Miss Prill had sent her for sheets, she had noticed a cup in the scullery she did not remember bringing down. Thinking it had come from upstairs, she had washed it and hung it with the others. She had not mentioned this because by then everyone was speaking in tones that made ordinary facts seem impertinent. "What was in it?" asked Rook. "I don't know, sir. There was a sort of mark." "Tia?" "I couldn't say." "Anything else?" "No, sir," Miss Prill said coldly. Which proves exactly nothing except the common danger of employing girls before their brains are settled. "Most brains never settle," said Rook. "One learns to make allowances." He asked Dr. Vesey to join them when he arrived an hour later. The doctor examined the cup, sniffed it, pronounced that sniffing washed china was not medicine, and then did it again. "If you hope for poison from a smell," he said, "you have been reading bad newspapers." "I was hoping," said Rook, "for your disapproval. It is more reliable." Dr. Vesey glanced round the pantry, at Miss Prill's outraged backbone, at Alice's impending collapse, and finally at the cup. "Well," he said, "if Mordaunt took tea in this after breakfast, it may matter. If someone else did, it may matter differently. If it came from downstairs 3 days ago, it matters not at all." "Thank you," said Rook. "That narrows it beautifully." The doctor ignored him. "Have you had the stomach contents sent?" "Yes." "Then wait." Waiting, however, was not a habit likely to improve the village. By 4 o'clock, the existence of a possible extra cup had reached the shop, the rectory, and the forge. At the shop, it was held to suggest poison. At the rectory, it suggested a clandestine visitor. At the forge, it suggested servants. Each interpretation had the great merit of confirming the speaker's views of life. Rook, hearing this by devious means before the afternoon was over, turned instead to the one person who might have used the cup without drama, Mrs. Barden from the laundry. He found her in the yard behind her cottage, pegging out sheets with a severity that gave the linen a moral aspect. "Yes," she said at once. "I was at the Elms. Miss Prill let me in by the side door because of the weather. No, I did not go into the breakfast room. Yes, I had hot water. No, I did not drink anything. And if anybody says I did, they are saying more than they know, which in this village is saying a lot." "Did you see anyone else in the house?" "Only that Mr. Vale, coming down the front passage, looking as smooth as pomade. Not morning smooth, careful smooth." "At what time?" "Near enough. 3. "Did he see you?" "Oh, yes," he said. "What beastly weather for linen, as if he had invented rain." Then he smiled at me in that nice way gentlemen use when they hope you have not noticed them. Rook thanked her and went out through the gate into the lane, where the hedges dripped and the road smelt of wet leaves. A second cup might mean a visitor. A washed cup might mean nervousness. But villages, like cupboards, contain many objects that belong somewhere else, and there was always the danger of attaching wicked purpose to ordinary untidiness. It was exactly the kind of assumption intelligent people made when they wanted life to begin making sense too soon. When he reached the high street, he saw Agnes Chalk locking the post office shutter for the evening. She noticed him and waited. "Well," she said, "someone appears to have had tea at the Elms." She considered this without visible surprise. Then either Felix Mordaunt was less solitary than he liked to claim, or someone drank tea under strain, which is more in keeping with him. "You do not sound alarmed." "Inspector, in Stallborn a misplaced cup causes more excitement than adultery because it can be discussed in daylight." That, Rook thought, was very nearly the best thing he had heard all day, and still it told him nothing certain except that the village had found a fresh object on which to hang its theories, and that someone, for reasons not yet plain, had allowed an ordinary cup to become quietly extraordinary. There are villages in which people lend one another things as naturally as they breathe, and others in which every borrowed ladder, casserole dish, and sovereign accumulates a history. Stallborn belonged firmly to the second kind. A favour, once given, did not end when the object was returned. It continued in tone in recollection, in tiny social adjustments, and in the altered way one person said another's name. Inspector Rook began to understand this on Friday evening in the rectory drawing room, where the rector, his wife, his sister, Mrs. Haviland, and an elderly curate from Little Bemford were all attempting to speak of Felix Mordaunt with Christian moderation and private relief. The rector, Mr. Pell, was a mild man with a forehead permanently arranged for troubled tolerance. He had asked Rook to come after supper, partly from duty, and partly because it was easier to be candid in one's own chairs. "A sad business," he said for the third time. "Not that Felix made himself easy to mourn, poor fellow, but one must hope well, one must hope." Mrs. Pell, who did not much care for hope when facts were lacking, said, "I hope, for my part, that people will not behave disgracefully to Agnes." "No one proposes disgrace," said Mrs. Haviland, in the tone of someone who feared precisely that and would like to pre-condemn it. "Only prudence. When a dead man leaves a written accusation, a dead man may also leave unpaid subscriptions and nasty habits," said Mrs. Pell. Rook, who had been served a rather determined slice of seed cake, asked quietly, "Did Mr. Mordaunt make a habit of setting people against one another?" All four considered this. The curate, feeling the moral field safest when watered lightly, said, "He encouraged distinctions." Mrs. Pell gave him a look of admiration mixed with pity. "My dear Mr. Lacey, if you mean he liked quarrels so long as he was not losing them, yes." The rector folded his hands. Felix had a difficult mind. He disliked obligation. "But imposed it?" said Rook. "That is, perhaps, nearer the mark." Mrs. Haviland, who believed precision ought not to sound like malice, added, "He had a way of helping in order to keep account of it. That is not charity in the proper sense, though no doubt he thought it business." Rook put down his cup. "Helping whom?" There was a tiny pause. Not long, but long enough to show that names had entered the room. "In small ways," said the rector. "He was trustee to one or two old local matters. He advanced money once or twice when families were in temporary difficulty. Quietly." "Quietly?" said Mrs. Pell. Her husband coloured faintly. "As quiet as he could manage." Mrs. Haviland smoothed a fold of her skirt. "He assisted Hilary Vale, I know, years ago when the Dower House was nearly let to strangers, and there was something with Major Cresset after his tenant left the South Field in such a state." The rector gave a small cough which might have been theological, but was not. Rook said, "Mrs. Chalk as well?" This time they all looked at him. Mrs. Pell was the first to recover. "Why do you ask that?" "Because several people speak as if Mrs. Chalk knows too much of local money." Mrs. Haviland said, "That is not the same thing at all." "No?" "No. Agnes knows because people tell her things while buying bootlaces, or because they fail to pay on time and must explain. That is trade knowledge. It is perfectly different." The distinction sounded important to her, which meant it probably was. "But no," said the rector gently. "Not to my knowledge. Agnes has always managed for herself," Mrs. Pell said. "And for half the village, when called upon." Rook let the matter lie, though it lingered with him. Felix Mordaunt, it seemed, had made loans, offered assistance, preserved papers, remembered debts, and disliked being indebted even for civility. That was not money in the large criminal sense. It was something much more local and often more poisonous, the right to remind people. Afterward, as Rook took his leave under the umbrella stand in the hall, Mrs. Pell followed him out. "You think Agnes hides something?" she said abruptly. "I think most people do." "That is a professional answer. It is often a practical one." She lowered her voice. "Then here is an impractical fact. Agnes has helped more people in this village than anyone knows, and most of them resent her for it afterward. It would not surprise me in the least if Felix understood that and used it." "In what way?" Mrs. Pell gave a tired little shrug. "By writing letters, by implying, by making people ashamed of being obliged." It was one of the few pleasures he could still afford. On Saturday morning, Rook called on the manager of the branch bank at Market Dene, partly because village finances are never village finances for long. Mr. Osgood, a polished man with careful cuffs and cautious sympathies, could tell him very little directly and rather more by the effort required not to. "No confidential impropriety, you understand," he said, polishing his spectacles, though they did not need it. But Mr. Mordaunt was old-fashioned, preferred private arrangements, short notes, handwritten acknowledgements, temporary accommodations between gentlemen, that sort of thing. "Between gentlemen only?" Mr. Osgood smiled thinly. "In principle, yes. In practice, money is rarely so selective. And Mr. Hilary Vale, I could not possibly—" "You could possibly say whether he lives easily. 1. No one who paints watercolors for county ladies' lives easily," said Mr. Osgood, then seemed annoyed to have been human. "And Major Cressit? A proud man. Pride is expensive in farming." Rook thanked him and went back to Stallborn more convinced than ever that the dead man's papers might matter less for what they contained than for who feared them. By midday, the high street had filled with the decencies of Saturday. Bicycles leaned against walls. The butcher had hung out rabbits, none of which looked pleased about it. At Mrs. Chalk's shop, a queue had formed whose members all wanted something obtainable elsewhere, but socially safer to purchase there. Agnes Chalk served them without comment until Rook came in. Then she handed Mrs. Hobb a packet of starch with almost ceremonial finality and said, "If you are here to ask whether I ever borrowed money from Felix Mordaunt, the answer is no." "You save time," said Rook. "I save yours. Mine is already committed." Nora Pike retreated prudently into the storeroom. Rook waited until the last customer had gone. "Then perhaps you will answer a different question. Did Mr. Mordaunt lend money to others in the village?" Mrs. Chalk gave him a measuring look. "He lent power, Inspector. The money was only how it travelled. That is a sentence with furniture in it. You must unpack it yourself." She moved to the scales and set weights in order with unnecessary precision. At length she said, "Men like Mr. Mordaunt do not help from softness. They help because it provides a second hold. First they have your need, then they have your gratitude. If gratitude sours, they still keep the first." "Did he have such a hold over Mr. Vale?" "Yes." "Major Cressit?" "Possibly." "And Miss Prill?" At that, her hands paused. "That is a stranger question." "Is it? Is it?" She had been with him 12 years. Housekeepers are always indebted in the wrong way. They know too much, are paid too little, and cannot leave without beginning again among strangers. "You pity her?" "No," said Mrs. Chalk. "I understand her." Rook watched her a moment. "Did she come to see you on Wednesday evening?" Mrs. Chalk looked up sharply. "Who says so?" "No one yet." "That is not an answer." "No," he said. "It rarely is." She turned away and began folding brown paper into neat triangles. "Miss Prill did not call here. Did you meet her elsewhere?" "No." "Then why are you angry?" Mrs. Chalk set down the paper. "Because you ask in that mild way of yours, as if truth were simply waiting to be invited out of people. It is not. Sometimes it is hiding because it knows the village will use it badly." Before he could answer, the bell above the door rang again, and Hilary Vale came in carrying a parcel wrapped in newspaper. He stopped at once on seeing Rook, then smiled with perfect sufficiency. "How domestic," he said. "Police, groceries, and mutual suspicion." Mrs. Chalk's voice became almost dangerously civil. "What do you want, Hilary?" "Anchovy paste, if civilization still permits it." "The Bard." Rook said, "Mr. Vale, perhaps you can assist me. Did Mr. Mordaunt ever mention Miss Prill to you in connection with private papers?" For a moment Hilary did not reply. Then he set the parcel on the counter. "No," he said. "But he once said housekeepers were the true archivists of England. They knew where everything was and whom it would hurt." The silence after that was so exact that even Nora, behind the curtain, ceased rustling. Mrs. Chalk said, without looking at either man, "Nora, fetch Mr. Vale his anchovy paste." It was a dismissal, but of which of them was not entirely clear. When Rook stepped back into the street a minute later, he carried very little that could yet be proved. Only this, that favors, debts, and stored-up humiliations had run through Stallborn for years in channels more private than scandal and more enduring than friendship. Felix Mordaunt had understood those channels. Very likely he had used them, and somewhere among the village's obligations lay the reason his last letters pointed so confidently, and perhaps so falsely, at the people who remained. Rain altered Stallborn by making everyone feel privately tested. On fine days, the village was capable of appearing almost decorative. Roofs behaved, hedges looked deliberate, and even unsuitable people could be seen at a distance and classed as part of the landscape. In rain, distinctions became intimate. Mud climbed, drains failed in principle, umbrellas disclosed character, and errands had to be performed by those who had hoped to avoid them. By Monday afternoon, Lime Close looked less like a row of cottages than a wet argument. Inspector Rook went there because Alice Drew had remembered something late and unhappily. He found her at her mother's cottage, sitting on the edge of a chair with the expression of someone who regretted ever having noticed anything. Mrs. Drew, a laundress with arms of practical theology, stood by the range and treated the inspector with the frosty respect due to authority that might upset a household. "Well, Alice," said Rook, when the preliminaries had been endured, "what is it you forgot?" Alice twisted the hem of her cardigan. "It wasn't forgetting, sir, only I didn't know if it mattered. Most things do to someone." She glanced at her mother, who said, "Out with it, girl." Alice took a breath. "On Wednesday, after Mr. Vale had gone from the Elms, or I thought after. Anyhow, I went into the side passage because Miss Prill wanted more coal for the sitting-room grate, and I heard voices outside by the little gate near the shrubbery." "Whose voices?" "One was Miss Prill's, I know that. The other was a lady's, but low. I couldn't be certain." "Could it have been Mrs. Chalk's?" Alice looked wretched. "I thought so at first. Only now I'm not sure I only thought so because of the letter." Mrs. Drew said at once, "There, you see, the whole village has had its head turned by a bit of paper." Rook ignored this with experience. "What did you hear?" "Only scraps, sir," Miss Prill said. "You should never have brought it here." And the other voice said, "I had no choice." Then I dropped the coal scoop and they stopped. When I looked through the side glass, there was no one there. "Did you tell Miss Prill?" Alice's eyes widened. "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because she'd have looked at me." This, from Alice, was explanation enough. As Rook left, rain struck again in a hard, slanting burst, driving water along the gutters and flattening the geraniums in the cottage fronts. He stood a moment under the narrow porch, thinking. If Alice was right, Miss Prill had met some woman privately near the side gate on the day of the death. If Alice was wrong, she had nevertheless produced a scene likely to poison every decent cup of tea in the village for a fortnight. He went next to Miss Prill. She received him in black silk that suggested bereavement as discipline. The house had grown quieter since the funeral arrangements began to gather shape. Servants lowered doors instead of closing them, and the clock seemed to tick with reproach. "I am becoming accustomed to seeing you everywhere," she said. "That is part of the difficulty," said Rook. "One becomes accustomed to the wrong things." He told her what Alice had said. Miss Prill did not exclaim or protest at once, which interested him more than protest would have done. "At the side gate?" she said. "Yes." "In the rain?" "It was not raining then." "No," said Miss Prill. "Of course not. That was later." She sat down without invitation, her hands folded exactly. "I did speak to someone outside." Rook waited. "It was Mrs. Barden, from the laundry." "You have said nothing of this before." "Because it was not dramatic." She brought back 2 pillow slips marked with the wrong initials, and I told her she ought to be ashamed of her standards. If Alice made romance of that, it is because she has never had enough to do. Mrs. Barden says she came later. Then Mrs. Barden remembers badly. Do you often discuss linen at the shrubbery gate? Miss Prill's eyes hardened. Do you often ask foolish questions in good rooms? Only when necessary. Did Mrs. Chalk come to the Elms that day? No. Did you meet her elsewhere? No. Did Mr. Mordaunt ask you to deliver a letter? No. Did he write more than the 2 notes I have? Miss Prill's face altered so slightly that most people would have missed it. Rook did not. How should I know? Because you know where the household pens are kept, how many seals were missing, and whether he rang for more blotting paper. For 1 second she nearly admired him. And because she nearly admired him, she disliked him more. He wrote letters often, she said. He enjoyed the sensation. That is not an answer. It is the only one I offer. Rook rose. Very well. Then let us try another subject. What hold did Felix Mordaunt have over Hilary Vale? Miss Prill looked down at her clasped hands. Financial nonsense. Men lend and borrow and call it honour till the figures go wrong. And Major Cresset? Pride. Mrs. Chalk? At that she looked up sharply. Agnes needs no one's protection. Protection wasn't the word. It is now. The remark hung between them long after it was spoken. Rook could have pressed then, but pressure applied too early, often merely improved resistance. He said instead, "Thank you, Miss Prill. I shall trouble you again. I had no expectation you would improve." From the Elms he walked through the rain to Lime Close again, this time to Mrs. Barden's. If Miss Prill lied, she had done so either from habit or necessity. The difference mattered. Mrs. Barden admitted him in a flowery apron, and no surprise whatever. "Yes, I saw Miss Prill by the side gate that Wednesday," she said at once. Not me she was talking to. Some other woman had just gone off up the lane in a dark coat. Did you recognize her? No. Hat pulled down, walked quickly. Not village quick, if you understand me. More like someone not wishing to become material. That is not a description I can circulate. You may improve it if you like. I only know it wasn't me. And Miss Prill looked as if she'd swallowed soap. What time? Near 2. Because I was late with the sheets and Mrs. Pell had already rung twice about the rectory surplices. Could it have been Agnes Chalk? Mrs. Barden considered honestly. Could have been her height, but then so are half the widows in the county. Agnes walks with purpose, though. This one walked with secrecy. There was, Rook reflected as he left, rather more difference between the two than Stallborn usually admitted. Toward evening the rain eased into a fine grey persistence. Lamps came on behind curtains. Smoke flattened over the roofs. And at the shop, where he stopped only to buy matches he did not need, Rook found Agnes Chalk alone, adding up accounts. She looked up as he entered. "If this is an official call, buy something more expensive. I have already paid for matches." Then it can only be personal curiosity, which is cheaper. He placed the box on the counter. "Did you go to the Elms on Wednesday at about 2 o'clock? She did not answer immediately. That alone was answer enough to make the silence significant. "At about 2, she said at last. "I went as far as the side gate." "Why?" "To return something." "What?" "A book." Rook looked at her. "Yes," she said with faint weariness. "I know how that sounds. But unlike Major Cresset, I am unfortunately telling the truth." "What book?" "Barrow's County Orchards. Mr. Mordaunt had lent it to me in spring to settle a ridiculous argument about rootstock. I had found it on a shelf at home and thought I may as well return it before he wrote asking why I had stolen it." "Did you see Miss Prill?" "Yes." "What passed between you?" Mrs. Chalk's gaze rested on him coolly, though the fingers beside her ledger had tightened. Nothing of importance. "Miss Prill appears to disagree." "Miss Prill often does." "What did she say?" Agnes closed the ledger with a firm, flat sound. "She said I should not have brought it there. I said I had no choice." Rook said nothing. Outside, the rain ticked gently against the shop window, discreet as a listener at a door. Then Agnes added, "If you are wondering why a housekeeper should object to the return of a horticultural book, Inspector, I advise you to keep wondering a little longer, which was not helpful. But it was, he thought, remarkably like the truth. The rector gave dinner on Tuesday not because the moment was suitable, but because cancelling it would have made the village worse. In towns, invitations may be altered without moral consequence. In villages, they become part of the weather. The rector's small dinner for 6 had been arranged a fortnight earlier in aid of no cause except sociability, and the death of Felix Mordaunt had only made sociability more dangerous, not less necessary. Mrs. Pell, who understood the matter exactly, said that if everyone stayed home with theories, there would be no living with them by Thursday. So the dinner proceeded. There were 8 in the end. The curate from Little Bemford had influenza, which created a vacancy. Mrs. Haviland filled it by claiming not to wish to, and Hilary Vale was added because someone had met him outside the butcher's looking abandoned. Inspector Rook was invited on the ground that he was in the village and had to eat somewhere, though the rector made the invitation with the cautious tone of a man who suspects he is seating a magistrate beside the fish. Agnes Chalk came because not coming would have been read twice. Major Cresset came because he had already accepted and did not alter plans under pressure unless war had been declared. Miss Prill was not invited, which was natural, and yet by 7:30 had somehow become one of the principal subjects on the table. The rectory dining room was long, narrow, and faintly ecclesiastical in its refusal to flatter anyone. Candles had been lit because the electricity behaved erratically in damp weather, which made the company look at once more intimate and less trustworthy. Outside, the rain had ceased, but the garden beyond the windows seemed still to be considering it. Mrs. Pell placed Rook between herself and Mrs. Haviland, where he could hear both tact and its correction. Agnes Chalk sat opposite Major Cresset. Hilary Vale, with social instinct sharpened by necessity, found himself at Agnes's left hand and looked as though he would have preferred a less educational arrangement. Soup carried them through the first stage, which was the stage at which everyone agreed the village had been sadly upset. Fish brought them to the second, in which they discussed funeral flowers and whether white lilies looked too Roman. It was with the mutton that the evening ceased to behave. Major Cresset had been speaking of drainage. This was unfortunate, but not fatal. Hilary, out of either mischief or self-defense, said that all village quarrels eventually became quarrels about water or land. "Or letters," said Mrs. Haviland. The remark was quiet, but it altered the room at once. Mrs. Pell said briskly, "Susan, what? One cannot pretend letters do not exist because they are vulgar. Felix wrote them. We have all received them." "Not all," said Agnes Chalk. Major Cresset looked up. "No?" Agnes cut her meat with exactness. "No, I never received one worth keeping," Hilary said lightly. "That may only mean he preferred the spoken nuisance in your case." "It may mean," said Agnes, "that he preferred to complain where he hoped to be answered." The rector cleared his throat. "I don't think—" "No," said Mrs. Pell. "But we had better, since everyone else is." Rook had not yet contributed anything beyond salt. He now said, in a tone almost too mild to disturb the gravy, "Did Mr. Mordaunt commonly write different accounts of the same matter to different people?" There was a pause in which knives and forks remembered their duties. "Frequently," said Hilary. "It saved him from consistency." Major Cresset said, he liked reinforcement, "Write to one fellow that another was incompetent, and to the second that the first was obstructive. Very old game." Mrs. Haviland looked pained. "Did he really do that?" "My dear Susan," said Mrs. Pell, "he did little else." Rook said, "Then it would not surprise you if he left more than one warning after his death?" At this, the rector looked positively clerical with dismay. Hilary stopped with his glass halfway to his mouth. Agnes did not move at all. Major Cresset said, "More than one?" Rook answered, as if discussing weather records. "Mr. Mordaunt appears to have prepared several notes. They do not all point in the same direction." It was remarkable how much civility could survive that sentence while meaning so little. Mrs. Haviland murmured, "How extraordinary!" The rector said, "Dear me." Hilary smiled faintly, though the smile had lost colour. Major Cresset put down his knife in the deliberate manner of a man who disapproved of being included in modern conditions. Agnes said, "That was like him, to continue quarrelling after death because life had not afforded enough time." No one contradicted her. After the mutton, port was offered, and almost all accepted it on the principle that one should not face other people sober beyond a certain hour. Conversation broke into smaller currents. Mrs. Haviland became absorbed in the deficiencies of an organist at Lower Frith. The rector asked Hilary whether the autumn exhibition at Market Dene would take local landscapes this year. Major Cresset spoke at Agnes about prices in the feed merchants, as though by addressing commerce he might avoid character. It was in one of the little lulls between these exchanges that Mrs. Pell, who had gone out and returned with the pudding, said to Agnes, "Did Felix ever lend you books often?" Agnes looked up. "Only when he wished to prove them against me." "Then why?" asked Mrs. Pell in the practical tone of a woman tired of half-truths. "Did Miss Prill tell my maid you had been borrowing from him for months?" The silence that followed was more complete than any yet achieved. Even Hilary, who usually kept a social expression on hand for emergencies, had to abandon his for a moment. Agnes laid down her spoon. "Did she?" "Yes." "How industrious of her." Mrs. Pell, unembarrassed by directness, because she used it for sanitation, said, "Well?" Agnes's face had become very still. "I borrowed 1 or 2 books on orchard blight in the spring, nothing more." "Not account books?" said Major Cresset suddenly. The question landed with a thud no one could soften. He himself seemed aware, a second too late, that he had spoken out of sequence. Rook turned his head. "Why account books, Major?" Major Cresset shifted slightly in his chair. "I merely meant if there were papers, records, whatever it is Mordaunt chose to preserve. A man who lends money keeps memoranda," Hilary said, with dangerous ease. "You sound knowledgeable." "I am knowledgeable," said the Major shortly, "about men who keep hold of old obligations." Agnes looked from one man to the other and said, "You are both being rather revealing, and not in a useful way." Hilary laughed. It was well done, almost enough to bring the room back, but not quite. "My dear Agnes, if one cannot be revealing over boiled cabinet pudding, where can one?" "At home?" said Mrs. Pell. It was very nearly comic, and therefore made things worse. Later, when the ladies had refused to go out, and the rector had given up, trying to preserve form against weather, Rook found himself by the drawing-room fireplace with Hilary Vale, who was examining a China spaniel, as if it had disappointed him artistically. "You dropped a stitch at dinner," said Rook. Hilary smiled without looking up. "Did I?" "I had thought. I merely breathed." "You were surprised by the mention of multiple notes." "Only by your timing. That is nearly an admission." "No," said Hilary, setting down the spaniel. "Only an observation. You know, Inspector, there are people in this village who survive by seeming harmless, and people who survive by seeming useful. Felix understood both kinds and distrusted them equally." "And which are you?" Hilary considered. "Seasonal." Across the room, Agnes was standing near the piano, while Major Cresset spoke to her in a low, controlled voice. They were not quarrelling. Quarrels in good rooms were seldom so crude. Yet there was something in the angle of his shoulders and the frost of her attention which suggested that each had arrived at the limits of old patience. Rook could not hear the words. He did not need to. Villages often revealed themselves best in drawing-rooms, where people sat among inherited furniture and tried to preserve surfaces already under sentence. By the time he left the rectory, he had learned one useful thing with certainty. Felix Mordaunt's death was no longer the chief disturbance in Stallbourne. That place now belonged to the possibility of papers, records, books, notes, acknowledgements, whatever name they preferred by which old favours might be translated into present danger. And everyone at dinner, in one tone or another, had spoken as if such things existed. On Wednesday morning, Inspector Rook began the dead man's correspondence in the only way such things can properly be begun, by discovering that no two people meant the same thing by the word papers. To Major Cresset, papers meant documents of standing, preferably folded into authority. To Hilary Vale, they meant letters capable of embarrassment. To Miss Prill, they seemed to mean whatever had been put where it did not belong. To Agnes Chalk, if she meant anything at all, they meant trouble already matured. And to the late Felix Mordaunt, whose handwriting marched across the village like an elderly grievance in boots, they had evidently meant power. Rook sat at the escritoire in the library at the Elms with 3 separate bundles before him, all produced under reluctance by Miss Prill and a local solicitor named Mr. Wepham, who had come over from Market Dene, looking like a man sorry to find death so untidy. "These are not," said Mr. Wepham, touching the nearest bundle with professional disapproval, "his testamentary papers. Those are in my office. These are merely private memoranda, drafts, notes, and copies of letters retained for reference." "Reference by whom?" said Rook. "By Mr. Mordaunt, one supposes." "Yes," said Rook, "that is what concerns me." Mr. Wepham coughed, which in solicitors often stands for moral unease. He was a square man with damp cuffs and a habit of treating human feeling as if it might stain vellum. "I should be obliged," he said, "if anything not directly relevant were spared circulation." Miss Prill, standing near the window in funereal black, said, "If Mr. Mordaunt had wished anything spared circulation, he would hardly have copied half his own letters." That, at least, was true. The first bundle contained what one might expect from a suspicious man living alone with time on his hands: complaints to tradesmen, notes on service, observations on weather as it affected drains, a long indignant draft to the parish council about bonfire, smoke, and a set of memoranda headed "Facts Worth Preserving." Under this heading, Felix Mordaunt had listed such matters as the rector called late and apologized inadequately, Vale evasive about subscription account and Agnes C. 2. Ready with advice, post office receipts. Rook read these in silence. "What did he mean by that last?" asked Mr. Wepham. Miss Prill said, before Rook could answer, "He meant she had given him advice and he resented accuracy." The second bundle was more interesting. Here were letters in copy, some complete and some only half-drafted, addressed to various people in and beyond Stallbourne. One to Hilary Vale hinted at the continued preservation of his father's obligations. Another to Major Cresset referred to the practical consequences of irregular tenancy arrangements and unwisely verbal understandings. There was one to the bank manager, so dry it seemed to have been seasoned in sand. Several were unsigned but unmistakable. All had the same unpleasant quality. They touched old vulnerabilities very lightly, like fingers testing a bruise. And then there was the third bundle. These had been tied separately with green tape and kept in the lower drawer, behind seed catalogues and a county almanac. The hand was still Mordaunt's, but the tone altered. They were not formal complaints or legal prods. They were private letters, some never sent, some perhaps copied after sending, and all addressed to one woman, Agnes. No surname, no courtesy, merely Agnes. Miss Prill's mouth compressed almost invisibly. Mr. Wepham became so professionally blank that he might have been trying to represent stone. Rook untied the tape and read. The earliest of them were 7 years old. They began stiffly, almost absurdly, with thanks for practical kindnesses, a parcel redirected, a Christmas hamper corrected after some shop error, the obtaining of a servant at short notice when his sister was ill. Yet even in gratitude, Felix Mordaunt managed to sound accusatory, as if favour itself were a form of pressure. Later, letters grew stranger. They showed dependence he did not like, irritation he could not govern, and a repeated effort to remind Agnes Chalk that assistance did not confer authority. One sentence returned in different forms. "I do not choose to be managed." Rook turned a page. In another letter, Mordaunt wrote, "You mistake your position if you suppose that, because you know the necessities of everyone in this village, you may arrange mine." And, later still, "If you persist in making yourself indispensable, you must not complain if others form conclusions." There were no declarations of sentiment, nothing that would have pleased a romantic reader. Yet, there was intimacy of a more exhausting kind. The intimacy of repeated friction, old habit, and the inability to leave another person out of one's thinking. Miss Prill said, in a voice of strained neutrality, "He wrote many things he never sent." "Did she receive any of these?" asked Rook. "I do not know," Mr. Wepham said sharply. "If this line of inquiry is to become scandal, it is to become explanation if possible," said Rook. He went on. Near the bottom of the bundle he found a shorter note, undated, folded separately. It had not been addressed, and perhaps never meant to be. The hand was more hurried than usual. If Agnes has chosen at last to meddle in matters beyond her understanding, she must bear the consequences. She believes herself protected by usefulness. It is a common female error. Should anything happen to me, it will not be because she intended far enough ahead, but because she cannot resist interference. Rook read this twice, then laid it down. Miss Prill said, "That sounds like him." "Yes," said Rook. "It also sounds prepared." Mr. Wepham shifted. "Prepared for what?" "For being believed." The solicitor did not care for that at all. Further search of the drawer produced account books, though not the kind Major Cresset had implied over pudding. These were domestic ledgers, seed purchases, wages, coal, repairs, one or two private loans, entered only by initials, and beside them, in the margin, occasional remarks in the same neat ink. Slow payer, resentful, to be reminded after Michaelmas. It was a ledger-keeper's revenge upon the vague. One set of initials appeared more than once, H.V., another R.C., and, on a separate page, not in the debt section at all, but among household advances and temporary disbursements, a single entry, A.C., returned in full, no obligation outstanding. Rook sat back. Miss Prill saw it and said at once, "There, you see." "What do I see?" he asked. "That she owed him money once, and returned it." "Yes." "When?" Miss Prill hesitated. "Years ago." "For what?" "I cannot say." "You can," said Rook mildly. "You do not wish to." Mr. Wepham, perhaps feeling the morning had already gone beyond what dignity could survive, took refuge in procedure. "If you require copies made, I can arrange it. I would prefer these not to leave proper custody." Rook looked again at the line. No obligation outstanding. It was, on the face of it, clearing. Yet in villages, debts repaid often continued longest in memory. He tied up the letters again and stood. "Thank you, Mr. Wepham, Miss Prill." As he reached the door, Miss Prill said behind him, "Inspector." He turned. "If a man writes enough accusations," she said, "one of them is bound to look like foresight." "Unless," said Rook, "he was counting on precisely that." She did not answer. Outside, the morning had brightened after rain. The yew hedge steamed faintly in the weak sun. Somewhere beyond the orchard wall, a gardener struck his spade into wet earth with the rhythm of someone determined not to think. Rook walked down the drive, with the dead man's letters now less revealing for what they said than for how they had been composed. Felix Mordaunt had not merely distrusted people, he had arranged his distrust. He had written, as a man, preparing not to tell the truth, but to direct it. And that, in a case already crowded with decent lies, was beginning to matter very much indeed. By Thursday, the village had reached that stage of excitement in which ordinary errands became nearly theatrical. People who had never before cared where they bought string now bought it where they might be seen buying it. Women took the long way past the elms, under the pretext of visiting someone ill, who had, in fact, been better since Tuesday. Men paused at gates for conversations, so brief and so repeated that their wives recognized at once they were discussing something they would later pretend not to mention. Even the postman, though professionally trained to indifference, carried himself with the alert neutrality of a man aware that every envelope might now seem explanatory. Inspector Rook spent the morning on what he privately thought of as his least dignified line of inquiry: movements. Not motives, not letters, not concealed humiliations, but who had gone where, carrying what, and at what hour. Crimes in villages often seemed at first to arise from passions, whereas they more often arose from timings. At 11 he was in Market Denay, where Mr. Wepham, the solicitor, admitted with caution that 2 days before his death, Felix Mordaunt had indeed sent a messenger with a sealed packet. "To whom?" said Rook. Mr. Wepham adjusted the papers on his desk without improving them. "Not to me personally. The packet was left with my clerk, marked to be held until called for." "Was it called for?" "Yes." "By whom?" The solicitor hesitated. "That is not usually a matter. It is now." Mr. Wepham gave a small sigh, the sigh of a man to whom murder seemed chiefly disorderly. "By Miss Prill." Rook did not move. "When?" "Wednesday morning, about 10:30. The morning Mr. Mordaunt died." "Yes." "For herself?" "She said she came on Mr. Mordaunt's instruction." "Did she produce any note of authority?" "No, but she was known to us." "And the packet?" Mr. Wepham looked downright unwilling. "A bundle of household receipts and a memorandum concerning staff wages. Nothing of legal consequence." "Nothing else?" "No." Rook let the silence lengthen until even the office clock sounded partisan. Then he said, "Mr. Wepham, I am less interested in what was of legal consequence than in what was of social consequence. They are rarely identical." The solicitor stared at him, then gave in with bad grace. There was also a smaller envelope inside, sealed, marked private. Miss Prill took that as well. "For whom?" "She did not say." "Did you ask?" "I had no reason to." "You have one now." But the man had nothing more. He only repeated that Miss Prill had come openly, in daylight, by the front office, and had signed the clerk's book in her own name. There was something almost insolent in such openness. Guilty people were often thought to sneak, but in villages they more commonly proceeded by habits already accepted as respectable. Rook returned to Stallbourne by luncheon and went straight to the elms. Miss Prill was in the morning room, supervising the laying out of morning clothes with that exact, exhausted competence which can make devotion look almost like hostility. She received the new information without visible alarm. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Mordaunt asked me on Tuesday evening to collect a packet from Mr. Wepham's office if it was not sent out in time. And the sealed envelope inside it? That was for him. Yet he was dead by 10:30. Not when I collected it." "No," said Rook. "Quite." She stood with one hand resting on the back of a chair. "I brought the packet home and put it in the hall desk. When Dr. Vesey was called and everything became confusion, I forgot it." "Did you open the smaller envelope?" "No." "Did Mr. Mordaunt?" "I cannot say. That is becoming your favorite answer." "It remains useful." Rook looked at her. "Where is the envelope now?" Miss Prill did not immediately reply. "Missing?" he said. "I have not found it." "Since when?" "Since yesterday." "One of the score. And you thought this unimportant?" "I thought," she said, with sudden bitterness, "that in a house containing a dead employer, police, servants losing their wits, and a village already half inside the front gate, there might be 1 or 2 delays before perfect order was restored." "Quite," said Rook. "And who knew you had fetched the packet?" "No one." "Not Agnes Chalk?" "No." "Not Hilary Vale?" "No." "Not Major Cressit?" "Certainly not." He believed she believed this, which was not the same as its being true. When he came out into the drive, Agnes Chalk was just entering by the gate with a basket on her arm. She stopped on seeing him, then glanced past him toward the house. "I have brought soup," she said. "For the household?" "Yes. Death does not improve staff meals. Miss Prill will be touched." "She will be fed," said Agnes. "That is usually enough." Rook took a step with her toward the door, then said, "Miss Prill collected a packet from Mr. Wepham on Wednesday morning. Part of it is missing." Agnes's hand tightened on the basket handle, though her voice remained level. "And do you tell me this because you think I took it?" "I tell you because I should like to know who knew it existed." She considered. Felix liked to send for things publicly when he meant them privately. It gave him the pleasure of secrecy and importance at once. "You knew about the packet?" "No, but I know the habit." "Would Miss Prill conceal it from you?" Agnes gave him a peculiar look. "Miss Prill would conceal weather from me if she thought I might use it." There was more in that than wit. Before he could follow it, the front door opened and Hilary Vale came out, hat in hand, moving with his usual air of expensive ease. He halted at sight of them both. "My dear," he said to Agnes, "I had hoped to find you at the shop. I was not aware hope entered into your errands." "How severe," Rook said. "Mr. Vale, were you calling on Miss Prill?" "In a manner." Hilary smiled at him with agreeable dislike. "I brought a note from Mrs. Pell about flowers for the service. Clerical kindness travels oddly." Agnes looked at the note in his hand and then at his face. "You came to the Elms to discuss flowers? Even the dead must be arranged. And you volunteered?" I was asked. "By whom?" Hilary's smile altered just enough to show tiredness beneath it. "Must every civil act in Stallborn now be treated as dramatic?" "No," said Agnes, "only yours." It was an ungenerous exchange, but not an empty one. Rook watched them. Hilary had come out too quickly, as if some conversation within had ended badly or too soon. Agnes, for all her outward coldness, seemed less jealous than angry, and anger, when not theatrical, usually had an object older than the moment. Hilary turned to go, then paused. "Inspector, since we are all being candid by coercion, perhaps you should know this. On Wednesday morning before the harvest show, I saw Major Cresset in the lane behind the elms." Rook said, "At what time?" "A little after 11. That is later than he told me." "So I gathered." Major Cresset, when found at the Hollies an hour later, denied it at once. "Vale lies as naturally as he paints," he said. "He places you behind the elms." "He would. At 11 on Wednesday." "I was not there." "Where were you?" "At home." "Who saw you?" "No one, confound it." "Must a man now keep witnesses for breakfast?" "You have already had one breakfast difficulty this week," said Rook. The Major coloured. "If you mean the book?" "I mean the falsehood." For a moment they looked at one another in a silence too blunt to be called social. Then Major Cresset said, more stiffly than before, "I went near the lane, not to the house." "Why?" The answer came after a pause, and came badly, because I had been thinking about what passed between Mordaunt and me the day before. And because I wished to see whether his gardener had moved the blasted fence again. It was possible. It was also absurd. In Stallborn, Rook had come to learn. The possible and the absurd walked together quite comfortably. By evening he had 3 new complications. A missing envelope collected in broad daylight, Hilary Vale emerging from the elms on a flower errand nobody quite believed, and Major Cresset admitting just enough about his movements to make the rest look worse. None of these things yet fitted, but each of them shifted the weight of the earlier story. For the first time, the accusation against Agnes Chalk no longer seemed merely ugly. It seemed useful, and useful to someone, Rook thought, was very often the beginning of the truth. By Friday, Stallborn had become tired enough to be dangerous. Excitement in a village does not continue at the same pitch. It thickens, sours, and begins to seek a conclusion of its own. People who have spent 3 days revising their opinions start to want the comfort of being right. They grow brisk in sympathy, firm in speculation, and offended by delay. Inspector Rook, who had seen this before in places outwardly calmer than they felt, spent the morning being told with increasing confidence what had obviously happened. At the butcher's, it had obviously been poison. At the post office, where Agnes Chalk served stamps with faultless impartiality, it had obviously been money. At the church gate, where Major Cressid stopped him after matins with an air of military candor, it had obviously been blackmail of the coarsest species. And in the lane behind the Dower House, where Hilary Vale encountered him quite by chance and too gracefully, it had obviously been panic following an accidental death. The variety did not discourage Rook. It reassured him. When a village begins to agree too quickly, it is usually protecting somebody. When it refuses agreement altogether, it is often because several people are protecting themselves in different ways. Shortly after noon, he asked Agnes Chalk if he might use the little parlour behind the shop for half an hour. She looked at him over a stack of invoices. For private reflection? For conversation. That is less private. Only if one talks loudly. She led him through the curtain without comment. The canary was still alive, which in itself suggested admirable perseverance. "I want," said Rook, when they had sat down, "to ask you about a mistake. That is an encouragingly broad subject. Miss Prill said something yesterday which I have been thinking over. She spoke as if you required no protection." Agnes's expression did not alter. "Miss Prill is not in the habit of supplying it." "No, but she spoke as if protection had once been offered." Agnes was silent. Rook went on. "In Mr. Mordaunt's ledger there is an old entry against your initials, returned in full. No obligation outstanding." "Yes. For what?" She looked toward the window, where the pale afternoon pressed softly at the lace curtain. "2 for my brother." Rook waited. "He drank himself into insolvency 15 years ago," she said. Not dramatically. He had not the imagination. Only steadily, while making promises. There was a small debt, enough to be noisy. Felix paid it because he happened to know before others did. I repaid him 6 months later. And he considered the matter closed? Agnes gave a dry little smile. Felix considered nothing closed if memory could still be used. Did he remind you of it? Not often, which was worse. That sounded like truth, Rook said. Did Miss Prill know? She knew everything in that house worth knowing, and a good deal else besides. And did you ever ask her to destroy any letter of Mr. Mordaunt's? At that, Agnes turned her head sharply. No, she said. Did she say I did? She said nothing. But other people have become very interested in what might have been written. Other people, said Agnes, are nervous of paper because paper stays polite. The phrase pleased him, though he did not show it. Then let us be impolite. Did Mr. Mordaunt threaten you in the last week? He wrote, asking me to come to the house. You went? No. I sent back word that if he wanted soap or sugar, he could have it sent for like anyone else. Why? Because I was tired. It was the first tired thing she had said since he met her. Of him? Yes. Of being useful? She looked at him with sudden steadiness. Inspector, there are women in villages who become useful because it is the only respectable form of power allowed them. Then, after 20 years, people resent them for possessing it. That is not tragedy, it is merely untidy. But Felix understood the arrangement and liked to prod it. Did he think you would come if he put you under pressure? He thought everybody came if properly inconvenienced. Rook rose. Thank you. For what? For not answering too neatly. When he stepped out into the shop again, he found Major Cressid standing by the biscuit tins, glowering at nothing purchasable. The Major had apparently come in for pipe tobacco and discovered moral discomfort instead. I should like a word, he said. You are having one, said Agnes. Not with you. That is a pity. You are often clearer when obstructed. Rook spared them both by leading the Major outside into the street, where the wind had begun to move the signboard in short wooden complaints. "Well?" he said. Major Cresset stood with his stick planted between his shoes. "I have been thinking about that note of Mordaunt's, the one regarding Vale." "Yes? I believe I was wrong." "About what?" "About the fellow's danger. Vale is weak, vain, and probably in debt, but he is not steady enough for murder. He would botch it by charm." Rook said, "And this insight comes late." The Major ignored the implication. "What I mean is that we may have mistaken the entire business by assuming Mordaunt wrote as a man in fear. He wrote, more often, as a man in control. That, from Major Cresset, was almost an apology to intelligence." "What made you think of it?" asked Rook. The Major hesitated. "A letter of my own. Not from him, from my late wife, years ago. I found it this morning in a drawer I had no business opening. She once wrote that the most dangerous people are not those who threaten, but those who choose the terms on which they may be pitied. Mordaunt had something of that." It was not the Major's usual kind of remark, and for that reason Rook believed he had not prepared it. "Did Mr. Mordaunt expect to die?" Rook asked. "No idea, but he expected to be interpreted." The sentence stayed with Rook all afternoon. At 4 o'clock he went to the Dower House, where Hilary Vale was in the studio pretending to work. The pretense consisted of standing before an unfinished wash of the church tower while smoking over it. "You look industrious," said Rook. "It is only an effect," said Hilary. "I am becoming attached to effects." Hilary flicked ash into a saucer shaped like a water lily. "Then you must be fond of the village." Rook looked at the unfinished painting. The church tower had been softened, the cottages improved, the clouds made lyrical. Only the yew beside the path had been rendered with hard accuracy, dark and rather oppressive. "You alter things," he said. Hilary smiled. "People pay for consolation." "And in life?" "In life," said Hilary, after a pause, "one alters emphasis. That is all society is." Rook turned from the painting. "Did Felix Mordaunt ever ask you to carry a message to Miss Prill?" Hilary's hand stopped halfway to his cigarette case. "No, but you did carry one." Hilary looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "If I answer that, Inspector, I begin to dislike the shape of the mistake we've all been making." "Perhaps," said Rook, "that is overdue." Hilary laughed once, quietly and without pleasure. "Yes," he said, "perhaps it is." Outside, the bell for evensong began across the damp air, measured and persuasive. In Stallbourne, bells often gave the impression that order still existed somewhere above the range of ordinary gossip. But as Rook left the Dower House and turned toward the church, he was thinking not of order but of arrangement. Felix Mordaunt had arranged his letters, his grievances, his debts, and very likely his final suspicions. Everyone else had then made the natural mistake of reading those arrangements as truth. The difficulty now was not to discover who had most reason to hate the dead man. It was to discover who had understood him best while he was still alive. The funeral of Felix Mordaunt was conducted on Saturday under a pale sky which suggested restraint rather than mercy. Stallbourne attended well. Villages always do, particularly when the dead have been troublesome. It is considered proper to show that death has improved nothing essential about standards. Major Cresset stood square and martial beside the Lishgate. Hilary Vale looked expensively sorrowful and succeeded only in appearing decorative. Agnes Chalk wore black without concession and spoke to precisely those who addressed her. Miss Prill, in a hat too old to flatter and too correct to criticize, stood by herself with the exhausted composure of one who had outlived both affection and novelty. Inspector Rook did not go into the church. He waited instead in the vestry parlour afterward, at the rector's request, and with Mrs. Pell's approval, which was the more practical authority. Presently they came in one by one. Agnes, Miss Prill, Major Cresset, Hilary Vale, Dr. Vesey, and, because he would have died of omission if left out, Gerard Fanshawe. The room was small, over-furnished, and faintly cold. Funeral flowers had been sent elsewhere, but their smell seemed to have followed. People sat down, as if not wishing to appear summoned. Rook remained standing. "I shall keep this brief," he said, which nobody believed. "Mr. Mordaunt's death has been made to look more complicated than it was, and simpler in the wrong places. The mistake, I think, has been to treat his letters as warnings." He took out the blue envelope first, then the other note found in the hall. They were not warnings, they were selections. Mr. Mordaunt wrote about people as he handled them in life one at a time, according to which of them presently offended him. Mrs. Chalk, Mr. Vale, perhaps Major Cresset, if he had lived long enough to draft another. He did not point to the person he feared. He pointed to the person he wished punished. Fanshawe made a small sound of affront, as though the dead had broken committee procedure. Rook continued. "So the letter naming Mrs. Chalk does not tell us who killed him. It tells us whom he wanted the village to suspect. That is a different matter." Agnes said nothing. She was looking at the window, where rain from yesterday had dried in streaks like old glass tears. Hilary crossed one leg over the other. "And here I had thought death improved a man's sincerity." "Not Mr. Mordaunt's," said Dr. Vesey. Rook turned to Agnes. "Mrs. Chalk concealed something, but not murder. The orchard book contained older papers, your brother's note of debt, and some letters Mr. Mordaunt had never sent. He had kept them, and Miss Prill did not wish them found at your house or his." Agnes said quietly, "No, it was not denial. It was assent, weary and exact." Rook looked at Hilary Vale, and Mr. Vale carried a message, not for Mr. Mordaunt, but for Miss Prill. "After the death, she asked you to tell Mrs. Chalk to return the book discreetly. You omitted that because you did not care to look like a man running errands in the middle of a scandal." Hilary's expression held for a second, then gave way. "I dislike," he said, "being useful in a servant's intrigue." Miss Prill turned her head. "You were useful in your own." "That also," said Hilary. Major Cresset shifted impatiently. "Is this leading anywhere?" "Yes," said Rook. "To the teacup." Miss Prill's face did not change, but it stopped being merely severe. It became attentive. The extra cup mattered because it was not a visitor's cup in the ordinary sense. It was a downstairs cup, plain white, blue rim, the sort a housekeeper might use when she sat down just once, and in the wrong room, Alice saw it. Then it was washed too quickly. Dr. Vesey, who had come to respect cups against his will, said nothing. Rook went on in the same even tone. "Miss Prill collected a packet from Mr. Wepham on Wednesday morning. She brought it back to Mr. Mordaunt. There was, among the receipts, a smaller sealed envelope. That envelope is missing." "It proves nothing," said Miss Prill. "No," said Rook. "By itself, nothing. But then there is the letter sent to Mr. Fanshawe at once." "You sent that, Miss Prill." The boy said so, and Major Cresset, though he was reluctant to become entangled, saw the boy leave by the side path later than he first admitted. All eyes turned to the Major. He looked as if he disliked being accurate in public. "I saw the boy," he said grudgingly. "I said nothing because it seemed servant business." "In this case," said Rook, "servant business was the whole case." There was a little silence. One heard the rector coughing distantly in the church, and the small dry settling of a coal in the grate. Rook addressed Miss Prill directly now. "You sat with Mr. Mordaunt, Aunt, after returning from Market Dene. You had tea. He told you what he meant to do about Mrs. Chalk, about the old debt, about the letter to Mr. Fanshawe, perhaps about you as well. Men like him always remembered to include one final insult." Miss Prill's hands, folded in her lap, tightened once. "You quarrelled," said Rook. "Not loudly. Loudness was not your way. At some point he was taken ill. Dr. Vesey says he had the sort of attack from which prompt help might very well have saved him. There was no poison. No stranger came in secret. No dramatic blow was struck. You simply did not help him." Miss Prill looked at him across the room with a steadiness that made everyone else seem suddenly restless. "At last," she said, "we arrive at plain speaking." Agnes half rose. "Emily." "No." Miss Prill's voice was quiet, and because it was quiet, it carried. "Do not begin protecting me now. I have had enough of that trade." It was the first time anyone there had heard her Christian name. Rook said nothing. Miss Prill drew off one glove, finger by finger, as if form still mattered and might as well be observed to the end. "He was not a man easy to serve," she said, "nor easy to leave. For 12 years, he required gratitude where there was only wages, loyalty where there was only endurance, and silence where there was too much knowledge. On Wednesday, he was pleased with himself. That should have warned me." No one moved. "He told me," she said, "that Agnes had forgotten her place. He meant to remind her. He said the old note would do very well once people remembered it, and the letter to Mr. Fanshawe would take care of the rest." He was amused. That was what I could not bear, being amused. Agnes said sharply, "Why did you not tell me?" Miss Prill turned to her almost impatiently. "Because you would have done something sensible, and I had reached the end of sensible." Her gaze returned to Rook. "He asked for the drops. They were on the tray. I knew perfectly well where they were. I sat there and did not hand them to him." Fanshawe gave a strangled noise, half outrage and half triumph at being present for something so conclusive. Dr. Vesey closed his eyes briefly, not in surprise but in professional annoyance at having been right too late. Miss Prill went on. "Afterward, I sent the letter. Habit, perhaps, or cowardice. For years, I had obeyed his written instructions more readily than his spoken ones. Then I opened the smaller envelope from Mr. Wepham and found he had written more of the same. About Agnes, about obligations, about consequences. I burned it." Hilary Vale said softly, "My God!" "No," said Miss Prill, "not at all. Only Felix." The remark settled over them with a kind of exhausted accuracy. Major Cresset cleared his throat. "Then Mrs. Chalk." "Mrs. Chalk," said Rook, "was exactly what the dead man intended her to be. Plausible. That is not guilt." Agnes was still standing. Her face had altered less than anyone else's, but the alteration went deeper. "You foolish woman," she said to Miss Prill, and for the first time in the whole affair there was no irony in her voice. "You abominable, faithful, foolish woman." Miss Prill's mouth trembled once, almost into a smile, and not quite. "Yes," she said, "that sounds nearer." Outside, beyond the vestry window, Stallborn was already beginning to resume itself. Two women passed under umbrellas, speaking closely. A cart went by toward the high street. The village would have the truth now, and by evening it would have arranged its sympathies into suitable parcels. It would be kind in some houses, severe in others, and tire of exactness before the week was out. But for the moment, in the small, cold parlour beside the church, the shape of the thing at last stood clear. A dead man who had tried to govern opinion after his own end, and a living woman who had once obeyed him too long, then failed him at the only moment that mattered. Rook picked up his hat. There was no triumph in the room, only relief, dismay, and that peculiarly English grief reserved for occasions when everyone has behaved recognizably and nobody has behaved well. Then Agnes crossed to Miss Prill and took the glove from her hand before anyone else could think what ought to be done. Outside, the bells began again.